Well, for months, it's been bubbling.
Mark Carney has failed to come clean with Canadians about his financial interests and his conflicts of interest.
I own nothing but cash and personal real estate.
And now it has blown up.
Well, it turns out, while he said that,
I own nothing.
he knowingly owned 574 stocks.
The world is just now getting a closer look at the financial disclosures of Canada's Prime Minister. And while Mark Carney insists he has followed all of the rules, the opposition is accusing him of having lied about his financial interests since before he was even elected.
And this will put him in an impossible position where he will be conflicted at every turn.
So let's explore Mark Carney's money, where it's invested, and how much of what both sides claim about it is actually true. Okay, so the first thing I wondered is, where does this 574 number come from?
He knowingly owned 574 stocks and deferred profits and stock options in Brookfield and other companies.
Well, here's a list of every stock Mark Carney disclosed, held in an investment account, managed by a third party, and now in a blind trust. Big name companies everyone would recognize: Airbnb, Alphabet, that's Google, Amazon, American Express, and those are just the A's. From Best Buy all the way to Walmart, Walt Disney, Warner Brothers, and beyond. There are 567 individual stocks in this part of Carney's portfolio.
Pierre Poilievre is trying to make the case that Mark Carney's investments are broad, his business history is broad, and he is trying to suggest that that means that the Prime Minister is compromised. He's trying to suggest a maximum number of potential conflicts for the Prime Minister.
But keep a couple things in mind. First, and this is something pointed out by the Ethics Commissioner, Carney had no control over the selection of these investments. They're part of a managed investment account where someone is effectively paid to pick the individual stocks so that the investor doesn't have to. And this is really common. Hedge funds, mutual funds, exchange-traded funds, they're how a typical passive investor goes about diversifying into many stocks. You hand over your money so that somebody can buy you a bit of everything. And that's actually why they tend to work so well, because so many people tend to pool their investment dollars to do this very thing, which gives them a stake in hundreds, if not thousands, of individual companies. That's how pension funds work. Now, just because investing indirectly with these massive, well-known companies is common, doesn't mean there's no conflict.
I mean, Carney's is filled with massive blue chip stocks. So he knows what's going in. He knows what's in there. He has a good sense of the economy. He knows what's profitable.
But most experts seem to agree. It's not these 567 stocks that are Carney's biggest problem, because for one, like I said, they're in a blind trust, which I'll explain in a moment. But there's another much smaller group of stocks and one very particular set of stock options that may represent the largest conflict of interest.
Just on your personal assets, do you have any, in Stripe and Brookfield, do you have any equity, stock options, or anticipate any future payments from either two of those companies?
So the first thing to say with respect to my personal assets is I have complied with all of the rules.
So when you're looking at the list of stocks Carney disclosed to Canada's Ethics Commissioner, arguably the most important page is the very first one, because that's where you'll find 8 distinct sets of investments where Carney has a more direct connection. Take Stripe, for example, the payment processor. Carney's a former board member. Watershed Technology, they help companies track their carbon emissions. They were founded by people who used to work at Stripe, and Carney was on a board of advisors there, contributing to their work in a few ways, as you can see here in this conversation with the company's co-founder.
How does a banker end up obsessed about climate change? What was your journey here?
Appropriately focused on climate change. Maybe I'll just amend the question.
And Brookfield Asset Management, a $1 trillion investment firm. Before entering politics, Carney was the board chair. And part of what he earned during his time at Brookfield was a whole bunch of stock options. Now, stock options are just a promise from a company to let you buy a certain number of shares at a locked-in price. So let's say I hold options to buy 100 shares at $10 each. Doing the math, that would be $1,000 worth of shares that I'm allowed to buy at that price within a certain time frame. But I don't buy now. I decide to keep holding those options. And 5 years later, the company's doing pretty well. And the stock price, let's say, goes up to $20 a share. Now I've got a pretty good play because I can exercise my option, buying 100 of those shares at the old price of $10. And then if I turn right around and sell those shares at today's market value, I've just made a neat $1,000 profit.
To some extent, it's the most valuable property that a shareholder has, because it's not just the present shares that he or she may have, but the ability to actually exercise future purchases, etc., which could be dramatically higher in value.
So here's the regulatory disclosure showing Carney's stock options in Brookfield. 2 sets of options, more than 400,000 of them in total, giving him the right to buy company stock at about $35 and $40 a share. The profit he could make if he did exactly what we just did in our earlier example, buying low and then immediately selling high, just over $6.8 million US. And actually, that's the expected profit given where the share price was at the end of 2024. Now, we're 6 months later and the price has actually gone up. So today, you turn those options around, you'd profit more like $8 million US. Either way, you start to see why Carney's critics believe this is a problem.
He has announced he's going to spend billions of dollars on modular homes. Brookfield is invested in modular homes. He says he wants to subsidize heat pumps. Brookfield is invested in heat pumps.
So part of the screen in place is that he should be shielded from making decisions that impact Brookfield-owned companies. Because in impacting Brookfield-owned companies, he impacts Brookfield's bottom line, which then impacts their share value, which impacts his option value, right?
So how has Carney addressed these concerns? Well, he's basically closed his eyes and pushed all of his investments to a trustee.
The blind trust is a trust that's administered by someone who's at arm's length to him, so not known to him, not a friend, not a former business associate, and approved by the Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner.
So in a nutshell, Carney would still own everything that he used to own, but someone else controls it, makes all the decisions, buy, sell, hold. And most importantly, Carney's not allowed to know what any of those decisions are.
It's in the hands of somebody else, and you will not be able in any way, shape, or form have to interact with that.
So what I have is cash, personal real estate, and they're assets all those assets were divested into a blind trust, which is managed by a trustee. And it literally means exactly what it says. I don't know what's in it.
But yeah, let's talk about that, because while it's technically true, he ceases to know what's in his portfolio once he hands it over. It's incredibly misleading because he knows.
I would imagine if you're hiring someone to manage your assets and your assets are performing well, you would expect that they wouldn't liquidate them, that they'd hold on to them.
Right. There's no reason for his trustee to wake up tomorrow morning and just beep, beep, boop, 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 decide to sell all of his shares in Lululemon. Why would he do that?
So I would imagine that there's some stuff in his portfolio that he's fairly confident would be there forever.
But right now, Mr. Carney is clearly not blind of what he holds, because even we know what he holds.
And Carney understands this. So there's another measure in place to shield him from conflicts of interest, and that is an ethics screen.
The simplest way to think about it is it's like a little bit of a flag that goes up. Maybe we could call it a red flag, where if a company that is listed under the ethics screen comes up in the course of conversation in the Prime Minister's work, everybody's supposed to take a beat and say, okay, can the Prime Minister continue to be involved in this conversation?
So basically, Carney has tasked 2 people, his chief of staff and the clerk of the Privy Council, to run informational interference, catch any file working its way up to the Prime Minister's office that has been flagged as a potential conflict and divert it to someone else. Which companies fall under this screen? Well, certainly anything to do with Brookfield and its many partnerships and affiliates. But there are more, 20 more, because, Carney says, I had a management position or an oversight role in respect of their investing activities. There are 4 on top of that included in the screen because they're registered as lobbyists. Then add another 73 companies out of an abundance of caution because they're Brookfield related, even though I had no role in managing them and no direct financial interest in them.
What's novel about the screens that are in place for Prime Minister Carney is that the breadth and scale of the number of companies and the industries that they would cover is huge, which means I think the average person looking in would say, is it possible for Carney to govern at all if he can't have make decisions or engage in public dialogue about these industries?
And this is where things get tricky, because under existing conflict of interest rules, if the government wanted to do something really ridiculous, like make August 1st Brookfield Day, a national holiday, Mark Carney would have to recuse himself from that decision and everything around it. But if the government is making a change to, I don't know, the capital gains tax, which does affect Brookfield, but not really in a fundamentally different way than it affects lots of people, that's okay. So what happens in the middle? If there's a policy that the government is contemplating that affects lots of people, but maybe affects Brookfield more, what should Carney do then? Well, he and the ethics commissioner agree that should be screened. And that's an extra layer we don't generally see.
These are 2 of the most powerful individuals in our government with access to a lot of resources. The clerk of the Privy Council is the head of the Federal Public Service and has the ability to draw on almost any part of the public service to assist in that.
But it also means that those 2 individuals who are in charge of the screen have to identify the companies, identify the industries, and then do a calculation about proportionality before making a decision about what crosses the Prime Minister's desk. That's a lot of gatekeeping, and I don't know how that's going to be operationalized.
The thing about trust is that it's really easy to undermine.
Just to be clear then, going forward, you have no potential equity stake, no potential stock options, or any other potential future payments that you currently anticipate could come from either Strike or Brookfield.
So what I have is cash, personal real estate, and their assets all those assets were divested into a blind trust, which is managed by a trustee.
This is one of those questions that voters, I think, tend to wish politicians would answer a little more straightforwardly, as in, yes, I continue to hold stock options for Brookfield, but here's what I've done to mitigate any potential conflicts. That's a straighter answer than saying, instead, well, let me answer your question this way. And while that may be a small thing, Carney's critics think there are lots of small things. Like when Carney name drops a company such as Westinghouse, as he did in the French leaders' debate.
Nous avons des grandes sociétés nucléaires, y compris Candu, Westinghouse et puis de Cameco.
Which might be a problem because Carney likes nuclear power. Westinghouse builds nuclear reactors, and Brookfield acquired a controlling interest in Westinghouse in 2023. Does that mean Carney acted improperly? No, not necessarily. But it's not just that either. For example, how do you avoid the appearance of a conflict of interest when, on the one hand, you've repeatedly promised to transform Canada into a clean energy superpower?
Canada has a unique opportunity to become an energy superpower.
But then you also hold a financial stake in an investment firm where you co-led efforts to raise capital for 2 major clean energy funds.
So my approach to public life, and I've been in public life for more than 2 decades, is to meet all the standards and surpass the standards with the highest integrity.
So yes, there are issues. But here's the other side of the coin. You remember when I said trust is really easy to undermine? I also mean that in the sense that it's just really easy to undermine, whether or not there are any supporting facts.
This Liberal government is doubling down on its insane ban on gas-powered vehicles. Isn't it true that this isn't about the environment, this is about the bottom line for Brookfield?
Given the breadth of his assets, there's going to be conflicts. You're not going to get zero conflicts here. I have no belief that that's even a possibility. What we need to see is how does he mitigate those conflicts so that he doesn't put himself in a position, to make a decision that benefits his own portfolio or that looks like he's benefiting himself.
So what's the solution? Well, the opposition leader put forward this week one concrete demand that Carney should go further than simply placing his existing portfolio into a blind trust. He thinks he should start all over.
We're calling on the Prime Minister to sell his investments, turn them into cash, hand them to a trustee who can invest them in a way that is completely blind to him, so that he does not have any knowledge of what he owns. That is the spirit of a blind trust. A blind trust is meant to be something that the owner does not know anything about. That's what it means to be blind of the assets.
But there's no indication Carney's willing to do this. So here's where we're at. Has Mark Carney followed all the rules? Yes. Does having outside financial interests make him incapable of governing? No. But will Carney's tenure be complicated by those interests? Yes. We should remember Carney's financial disclosures are evidence that part of the system to avoid conflicts of interest works. But sitting prime ministers also don't usually have ethical screens hindering them from making decisions affecting more than 100 companies across multiple sectors. Right now, we don't know how effectively his government will manage those conflicts, but we'll certainly learn over time.